thoughts in terms, let's focus on the agriculture sector for now, since you've done a lot of interesting work on that. What do you think needs to happen in India from an agricultural perspective? And do you think that what the government is doing right now is adequate? I think it'll come on automatically.
It'll come on. Okay, yeah, thank you. So before I start, just want to tell you that while these guys were talking about this Cambridge, I thought about when I was an undergraduate in the UK Cambridge, and we were 10 women in a class of 150, and I was the only Indian woman in that class. it's changed a lot now. So I think the kind of scenario that Mr. Sinha has painted is a bit of a pipe dream, and we come down to reality. I love dreams. We must all dream, but it has to be based on a degree of reality. And I think if you look at agriculture and the rural economy, you touch base on what is reality. So we do know that agriculture provides 16% of the GDP, something like 50% of employment, but 70% of the rural economy, much of which is agriculture, 70% of people are based in the rural sector. Now, if you take the growth rates, the long-term growth rates, well, long-term, who knows what we mean by long-term, but let's take the last few years, it's been about 2.8% annual growth rate. And there are serious structural issues here. So while we may give farmers income, yes, we must give farmers income, and the transfers are very welcome, but they don't solve what I see as the major problems in Indian agriculture. For a start, water, if you want to change and transform agriculture and transform the economy, we have to increase productivity. And not only consumption, because productivity is the thing which will enable farmers to feed themselves in the long term and transit out of agriculture in the long term. Now, if you take irrigation, in all these decades, only 44% of our irrigable area is irrigated. Much of it has been through groundwater. Groundwater has been depleting at completely unsustainable rates. So if you take Punjab, our breadbasket, some of you may remember the images of Punjab in the 50s when you Google people playing with water. And now you have a decline over the last many years of 2.3 feet annual decline of groundwater per year. Many districts have hit arsenic level. Across 12 states of India, 94 districts, you hit arsenic. And so what's happening is there's irrigation questions, and then what happens to the rural economy, because it dries up your bore wells, it affects your drinking water. The second is, did you know that about 38% of our soil is degraded? The third and absolutely immediate question is that of climate change. Now, there's been rather little discussion in the economic survey of 2020 in the agricultural chapter on climate change. There's discussion in the sustainability chapter, but I feel totally inadequate. Now, every single measure that you take, no matter who's done the studies of the past few years, we know that South Asia in general and India will be hugely negatively affected by climate change. Wheat, rice, maize, all our crops, unless we farmers adapt, are going to decline hugely. China won't be affected in quite the same way. It might actually gain in some parts. But India will be hugely affected. And the fourth, of course, question is that not everything flows with money. We might believe that in the business school, but institutions matter. So if we consider that 86% of our farmers cultivate less than 2 hectares. Much of it is non-viable. They have very little power, political or other power, to make a difference, notwithstanding occasional demonstrations. The really marginal and poor farmers and agricultural laborers, who, by the way, it's not clear whether they're getting the transfers or not. What are we doing in relation to institutions? So, did you want me to talk about where we could go from here? We can come back to that. So just as a small plug, I believe that it's not competitiveness which is going to lead to sustainability. Cooperation is perhaps the only key to sustainability. And I'm very happy to elaborate on that in the second round.
Thank you very much, Bina. I appreciate it. That's great. So Mihir, we just heard from Jayant. The Prime Minister has been talking about 5 trillion. Jayant's kind of forget 5 trillion. Let's focus on 10 trillion. Um, through a whole variety of initiatives, which I think, the last 3-4 years, there's some pretty important initiatives like the GST, like introduction of the bankruptcy law, uh, some of the other efficiencies that Jayant talked about. But you've very, very clearly said in your view that this is all, I don't know how to describe it as to how you would actually say that, but you've talked about this is a mess of ideas, of mixed up priorities, et cetera, et cetera. Can you elaborate on that perspective, please?
Well, I think that first of all, I just want to say that I broadly agree with a lot of what the story that Jayant has told, right? But I will take sort of issue with one thing that he said, which is that wondering whether India is in a structural or a cyclical slowdown is sort of a sterile debate. And it's not sterile because only when you know what's wrong with the patient do you know what to give the patient, right? And the problem essentially is that the government right now is faced with an economy, a macroeconomy that is ailing, and it is giving it medicine for its structural problems, it is giving its medicine for its cyclical problem, it is giving its medicine it doesn't need anyway, plus it's like throwing a couple of leeches on, bleeding it, Ayurveda, everything is being tried, right? And most of this is, a lot of this is good, but a lot of it is going in the wrong direction as well. So the point is that you have to have a clear idea of what has gone wrong and then figure out what it is that you can do to fix it. So if I was to sort of very quickly recapitulate the story that Jayant is saying, but give it a sort of single linear narrative, I think that we've had for almost a decade now in India a crisis of private investment. Right? And since 2011, since the post-boom stimulus, there were a lot of inefficiencies and structural problems and institutional problems that were revealed at that point, and many of those caused people who would have otherwise invested in the Indian economy to step back and say, look, I'm not certain. There's too much risk here. There's risk at state levels. There's judicial risk. There is administrative risk, and there are a bunch of things that I find problematic, and I'm going to hold off on investing. So you saw a big, and this is a big macro, stylized fact. You saw a reduction in the proportion of investment to GDP. Right now, it's very hard to keep growth going when you don't have enough investment, particularly enough private investment. So what you had in order to actually keep growth going was twofold. Two things stepped in. The first was household consumption. All right, so people kept on spending. You had demand, and that kept some corporate earnings growing and kept the economy looking good. And you had the government step in as well to try and prime the pump with public investment. Both these engines have now run out, and household demand in particular has crashed because, as Jayant said, you've had a credit problem, right? So the non-banking financial sector, which was helping keep the household credit going, has shut down. So a lot of that engine of the economy, which was household credit, therefore demand, therefore growth, is no longer working, and now we've got an additional issue, which is that the government is slowly running out of resources as well. All right, and the GST, which was a very positive and important move, has unfortunately maybe not quite fulfilled its promise in terms of government revenue, and we can go on to why that may be the case later. But the fact is that the government, both at the central level in particular, is chasing revenue a little bit. So we're now in a crisis because we have no engines of growth left. And the government that would love to be the engine of last resort, as it were, is now out of money. And the only way that it can recover any money is by going after private wealth creators who therefore are even less likely to invest. So you actually have an impasse of a particular kind. Now, that's the crisis that we face. And now the question I guess we should be asking is, where do we go from here? How do we get out of this sort of blank wall? And I think one of the problems that we need to recognize about the way that I've just told this story to you is that it's a very India-focused story. We're talking about the government has run out of money, Indian consumers are not buying Indian goods, etc., etc., etc. Right? The crucial thing here is that you cannot rely on Indian resources alone for investment, and you cannot rely on Indian demand alone for future growth. So you need to once again plug yourself into what Jayant called the older engine of growth, which is liberalization and globalization. You need to be able to ensure that your producers are producing for the world. So we have broadly flat exports for the past 5 to 7 years. Meanwhile, Vietnam grew exports at 9% last year. Bangladesh grew exports at 10% last year. These are our peer our peer economies in terms of exports. There's no reason why we should not be doing that well. Instead, we've closed ourselves off. And finally, we need to stop looking only at domestic taxes or domestic, resources as the only way to finance infrastructure. We need to get foreign resources in. We need to get foreign resources into financing our government if necessary. And I think there at least we have figured out that this is something we need to do. We haven't quite figured out our trade policy yet.
So just on that, let me just push back on a couple of things. So one is you talked about GST. I mean, when you have structural reforms like GST, the benefits of that take a long time to actually come through, and it's only been a couple of years. So that would be one for you to comment on. And second would be this whole issue of investment, foreign investment, etc. Since outside the HBS thing, I'm quite involved with that. India has pushed to kind of improve their the ease of doing business, and they actually acknowledge the fact that this World Bank report matters. Previous governments had totally ignored it. What's your comment on those two? And then I'll move to Jayant.
See, they're both absolutely, accurate points. The first is that about stuff like the GST and even the insolvency and bankruptcy bill, they're going to have teething problems. These are structural changes that we have to work out what the immediate, we can't judge their structural impact just from their immediate effects. However, about the GST, I think two things have to be accepted at this point. That it is not causing a bump to government revenues in the way that we had hoped and expected, that some people had hoped and expected. And the second is that it is being seen by many taxpayers as a little overly complex. And that was, not the promise of the GST. Now, these are, again, things that can be fixed if the political class and the bureaucratic class is awake to these complaints and acts on them quickly. So far, we haven't seen that, but it's entirely possible it'll happen. On the second thing, foreign investment, yes, there has been a shift now into talking about the ease of doing business, and this is again something that we need to welcome. But simultaneously, we have to recognize that there are fundamental issues that go beyond the kind of stuff that goes into the World Bank indices. Right? The World Bank index will tell you, on paper, in Delhi and Bombay, how long does it take you to get an electricity connection? It does not tell you the likelihood that the Supreme Court will, 12 years after you've made an investment, essentially impose catastrophic capital loss on you. And the reason that people are not investing large amounts in India is not that they're afraid that electricity will take them 14 days instead of 12 or 10. They're worried about catastrophic capital loss. And unfortunately, we are getting a name for ourselves as the kind of country that does that.
All right, thank you. So Jayant, you have two important naysayers here. How would you react to both the structural issue and agriculture, and I'll come back to say that's such a core part of the Indian economy, as well as this whole issue of stimulating demand and getting foreign capital in? There's just not enough being done about it.
So I am an optimist by nature, which is why I guess I'm an investor and a politician. Unlike my friends from across the river who tend to be more professional pessimists, I look to the future with great.
You really got something against the Kennedy School. Are you going to keep on?
I just see the tone of the conversation. Everything will be proven to you right there. Because we first had this crisis in agriculture. Here are the three reasons why agriculture is just completely going to collapse. And then we had Mihir talking about the crisis in investment, and that's why investment is going to collapse. So, what do I have to say? Professional pessimism is in front of you. But let me just, let me address both of those as quickly as I can. So, as far as Mihir is concerned, because he talked about investment, let me just put up a few numbers. So, in 2013-14, the amount of private equity and venture capital going into India was $10 billion a year. Now, the amount of private equity and venture capital going into India is $35 billion a year. If there was a crisis in private investment, why is private equity and venture capital the smartest, savviest, cleverest investors on the planet more than 3 times increase their investment in India if there was an investment crisis? So there is no investment crisis. If you look at FPI also has been going up. That's foreign portfolio flows. Certainly FDI and of course private equity, venture capital have all gone up dramatically in the last 5 years and are continuing to grow very, very rapidly. So there is no private investment crisis. It is true that we had in 2007-8 a peak of investment that was largely driven by very, very lax credit policies, very promiscuous lending, which came to a crashing halt when actually there was a stronger effort to ensure that underwriting standards were much more disciplined. We, of course, went through the asset quality review, which I myself, along with Dr. Rajan, undertook when we were in the Ministry of Finance, and that naturally meant that a lot of investments that were not being done for the right reasons stopped. And that's part of the reason why investment, if you look at it at a macro level, in terms of the investment ratio relative to GDP, has come down. But today, and I'll just give you one example to show you why these macro numbers cannot be relied on. But today, investment is strong in all the sectors that need investment. Today, if you're looking to grow and you have a thriving business, let's ask Kalyan Krishnamurthy, who just got $16 billion from Walmart to make an investment in Flipkart. So if you, and Ritesh is here from Oyo Rooms, he's got a lot of money coming in from SoftBank. So if you've got scalable, large-scale businesses, they are getting funding. And in fact, a lot of people will tell you that valuations are at very stretched high levels because there's too much capital chasing too few deals. So that's happening absolutely on the ground. And now let me just very quickly illustrate why these macro investment numbers are something that we need to take with a full, not just a grain of salt, but a tumbler of salt. Because let's take aviation, which is something I know about. In aviation today, all planes are leased. They're not bought. Does that show up as investment? It doesn't show up as an investment. But if you look at the number of planes we had in 2014, there were 420 planes that we had in 2014. Today we have almost 700 planes. We've added 300 planes in 5 years. Has that shown up as an investment on our macro numbers? No, because the planes are being leased instead of being bought. So we have to be very careful about these large statements that are made about investment numbers, because there's a lot of business model and structural changes that is happening underneath these numbers. Capital and the use of capital has become much more efficient. So that's on the investment crisis. Now let's come to agriculture. Obviously, there are a whole host of challenges that we're dealing with in agriculture, but there are solutions at hand as well. If you look at the Jal Jeevan Mission, which is to address the water issue, the government is pouring 3 lakh crores 3 lakh crores into जल जीवन मिशन, और हम लोग कह रहे हैं कि हम लोग हर घर में हम लोग पानी पहुंचाएंगे और हर खेत में हम लोग पानी पहुंचाएंगे, और हम लोग कर भी रहे हैं. That is, we are providing water to every household, and this is underway, and we are going to provide irrigation to every single field. And I can assure you, because we've done it with gas, we've done it with electricity, we've done it with toilets, we're going to get this done. This is the number one overriding priority through the Jal Jeevan Mission. We are going to provide water, and there are solutions. Similarly, as far as soil degradation is concerned, soil health card, again, I don't want to get into all the details, but that is a problem that we've been focusing on. We are moving in terms of fertilizer and pesticide use very much to natural farming, organic farming. So we can go through and be a professional pessimist and keep on talking about the problems. But the good news about being an investor and being in public life is that you get an opportunity to provide solutions. And I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, we are committed to and are succeeding in providing solutions. And I'll end by saying the following. When our government came to power, only 45% of Indian households had toilets. Today, virtually every single Indian household has a toilet. That is a remarkable achievement. Let's talk about that. And I can go on with bank accounts, I can go on with natural gas cooking, I can go on with electricity, but we've achieved these goals because we are solution oriented. Thank you.
And I think I would say, add to that, Jayant, is that at least the proof is in the pudding that as a result of that, you came in, the BJP came in with a resounding majority. Now, having talked, before I get to Bina on agriculture, you have a resounding majority in Parliament. What would be the one or two things which you think the government should be doing, which it actually is not doing, and to use that majority to the advancement of the country?
I mean, on the one hand, Mihir is saying we're already doing too much. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I want to add many more things. I think we have a very well defined policy agenda. We are addressing all of the key areas, and Mihir was saying that we don't have a diagnosis. That's entirely inaccurate, Mihir. I laid out the diagnosis in front of you when I said to address the growth slowdown right now, we're focusing on consumption. Medium term, to get to $5 trillion, we're focusing on the investment cycle. And then when we talk about longer term, which is to get to 10 trillion, we're talking about an innovation driven economy with really high quality educational institutions, very, very vibrant startup ecosystem. So we have a very, very clear policy roadmap.
Okay. So, Bina, let's talk a little bit about agriculture. What would you, if you have been advising the government in the past, if you were advising Jayant and his colleagues on the standing committee and the Prime Minister, what are the three things you think they should be doing on agriculture which they're not?
Thanks. But just before that, one basic issue of methodology is that those who start a scheme shouldn't be the evaluators of a scheme. So when they say they've put in all these toilets, fair enough. What proportion are actually working? If you say you've got LPG in every household, what is happening? Are women using them in their kitchens in a large proportion? So
very quickly, Binaji, very quickly, let me tell you that as far as toilets are concerned, it is being audited and monitored by multiple independent auditors, and this is being done by a series of agencies, some of which are associated with the World Bank as well. So as far as toilets are concerned, and by the way, behavioral change doesn't happen in 5 years. Toilets have been built. It is true that not all of them are being used right now. We can discuss the numbers by state, etc. That is being independently verified, but the changes are underway. And as far as gas, so we can go on and on under each one of those. Please be assured, please be assured that all of us are accountable to the public, okay? And I'm very much accountable to the public. If I deliver any benefit and it is not working for the people, I know about it immediately. So the best auditor, the best monitor, the best verifier of anything is the people of India, and believe you me, they make sure you get your job done.
If you're going to if you're going to the villages, they'll say, "Acha, इन्होंने हमारे बारे में सोचा तो सही." At least they've given us something. That doesn't necessarily mean they're using the toilets or the toilets are working. So I think there are complications of evaluation, and you've nuanced it, so that's fair enough. So I won't spend more time on that. I think you've got the right plugs. Water conservation, irrigation, we're looking at the health of soils, we're looking at the health of farmers, etc., etc. But I think it's really, if you look at the figures of what's happening on the ground. So you asked me, what are the three things one should be doing? Firstly, water, irrigation, conservation, absolutely. But it has to be precision, and we have to conserve water. So if you simply look at some of the water statistics, in 1997, the government decided to, free electricity. 97 to 2002, you had huge decline in the use of canal irrigation, and most of it went into groundwater irrigation. So some of these policies which seem okay, when you actually fine-tune them, can have actually the opposite effect. What we do need is micro-irrigation, and just to give you some figures, some 7 to 8% of farms in India have drip irrigation, sprinkler, and so on. China has 48%. Yesterday we were discussing why Chinese yields been so much higher. This is one of the factors. That how do we go about implementing something when we use the same words, conservation and irrigation? And this requires, if you're talking about rainwater harvesting, it requires cooperation by communities. It's something which the other side of the river does talk about, and I think we need to start talking about it on this side of the river. And climate works in a very complex way, because if you take a poor wheat crop, it'll be affected by precipitation, it'll be affected by fluctuations in heat, it'll be affected by how much standard deviation away from a certain temperature. So all of that has effects on climate. And I think we really need huge amounts of research in crops which are adapted to and heat resistant. It is required in India. It requires much more global cooperation because there are similar problems arising elsewhere. How much are we spending on just research on crops? I think it was 0.4% of the agricultural GDP. Half of that over Brazil and so on. But third, if I may, and this is really, I feel, could be transformative, is institutional change. So I'll give you an example. I mean, when I ask you, well, suppose I were to say, why don't farmers, if 86% of them cultivate less than 2 hectares, and there are two American economists who asked this question, are Indian farms too small? And they came up with a relatively precise figure that as you move up from less than 2 hectares, well, very much below, up to 8 hectares, your profits per hectare will increase, and especially up to 2 hectares. So, how do you bring that about? And one obvious way you would say is let's pool our resources. Can we encourage farmers to pool their land, labor, and capital and do group farming? Now, some of you might say, well, we tried it in the 1960s. In India, we tried it in Asia, Latin America, it didn't work. It didn't work because we knew rather little about how to go about collective action. Again, something, if I may say, there's quite a lot of theory on the other side of the river on collective action. There was a lot of skepticism on that. Today, we know that's not the case, both theoretically and in practice. So I asked this question, well, if farmers did pool their land, labor, and capital, would they be more productive and profitable than individual family farming? And luckily, I found two examples in Andhra and Kerala, and especially in Kerala in India today. There were 64,000 all women's groups, 4 or 5 women coming together, leasing in land. And I compared on a systematic basis through data I collected over an entire weekly data for every input and output. The group farms and individual family farms, 95% of which were male managed. And the women's group farms, the annual value of output was 1.8 times higher than the individual family farms. The, yeah, the profits were 5 times higher than the individual family farms. Now, some of this has to do with economies of scale. It also has to do with labor saving, because in peak periods, you can't hire labor. Wage rates have been going up in many states. And there's an issue of trust. I think this is something that the business school knows a great deal about, that on contracts, people know that they will deliver on contracts if there is a group than if you have an individual family
Right.
farm.
So microfinance would be an example of that.
Well, no, not so much microfinance as the institutional structure of these groups.
Right, right. The self-help.
It's not the money, but it's the coming
No, it's what I'm
together.
talking about. The self-help groups had basically a joint structure of accountability.
And some of the things that the government has done, which is that if you form a group and you've worked well for 6 months, you can actually apply to NABARD, the Rural Development Bank, and get credit without collateral.
So I think that's a great suggestion, and we should, a couple of great suggestions, which I think would be good for maybe Jan to take back the BJP thing.
Very quickly, Vikram, we've already through FPOs, farmer producer organizations, which is the whole idea of collective action of farmers, put a lot of money into them.
And I need to counter this just for a second. There are 3,000 farmers, producers, organizations. There are 64,000 women's group farms in one state. The study, IFPRI has just done a study that hasn't been published yet, where they say many of these are very negative selections. So, and FPOs are mainly doing marketing.
So, Binaji, the answer is there are a lot of people applauding. Why don't you collect them all into an NGO or a for-profit organization? I'm sure Vikram will fund it through ASHA, his social initiative, social finance. Let's get on the ground and make it happen.
It's happening, but
good, excellent. Let's do it.
All right. Let me just before I want to open this up to the audience, but before I do that, I will come last. So it's easy for all of us to take shots at the government. I would argue that they were doing a lot. Just taking the other side of it, so that we have a 2x2 kind of thing over here. Yeah, that's right. So what are the two things that you would do if you were the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister, which is not being done right now? Two very tangible things.
Well, I think the first thing that you have to do is to tell your tax guys, all right, that look, stop chasing people who are who are creating wealth within the country. Now, he said it in public. That's not what's happening in practice, because everyone's been given targets, and you have a situation where tax, you're back in the bad old days of the 1970s, tax planning, etc., nonsense like that. You have to, stop this. If not being able to raise resources for the government, you can't, somehow supplement it by squeezing whoever you have within access. The second thing that you have to do is like, look, this negative view that we have taken on openness and trade has to come to an end. Under this government in the past 3 years, for the first time since liberalization in the 1990s, we have started raising tariff barriers across the board. All right, this is in an age of global value chains. Instead, bureaucrats are coming and saying, picking, all right, this particular electronic input, we think we're going to raise the tariffs on. Next year, we've reduced them. Third year, we've raised them again. We're back again to the 1970s when it comes to trade and tariffs, which is why nobody wants to invest in manufacturing in India if if tariffs are no longer predictable, if your ability to plug into global value chains is not predictable. So you are not going to be able to move forward unless you have clear and coherent tariff policy and your clear and coherent tax policy, and those are not things that the government is providing.
Thank you, Mihir.
Oh, and just on a final point, look, we can come up with stories of, so-and-so is raising money and so-and-so. This is great, all right? And I love the fact that some people are able to leave here and go to private equity and raise money. In terms of, as a proportion of GDP, FDI into India is under 2%. All right, it was 1.4% when the current government took over in 2014. It went up to 2% in 2016 and is down now to 1.6%. These are numbers that are not enough to change the scale of the investment problem we have in India, where investment has to move from 28% to GDP back up to the high 30s. And just for comparison, when China was growing, FDI as a proportion of GDP was 7%. At its high in the 1990s. If the foreign-owned proportion of the capital stock in India was 25%, or in China was 25%, and that is nothing like what we have in this country. So, in order to transform how India looks, you need foreign capital, and at that scale, and we have to start thinking like that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly every study would show that capital formation in India is not adequate, so FDI is critical. Let's start the question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Asha Jadeja, and I'm one of the top 3 venture capitalists from Silicon Valley, even though I may blow my own trumpet. Just wanted to let you know that I've just started investing in the last about 7 years in India as a venture capitalist, and I am extremely bullish on Indian startups, but I have had nothing but pushback and sabotage from the Indian government. It has taken me 6 months to get $20,000 into a company in Delhi, $20,000 into a bank account of a company called EDAC, which is in Delhi, started by a teenager. Is there anything I can do as a venture capitalist to get the government out of the startup ecosystem? Please, we need it out. Otherwise, it's going to spook out a whole bunch of other. Right now, I'm willing to put up with this nonsense because I'm Indian and I really want to help my country. But if there is the Sequoias and the Excels and all who want to really set up a $1 billion fund in India, looking at what the Indian government is doing, the Babu Dam is doing nothing but sabotage of Indian startups. Please help us and tell me what you can do.
So we had this whole startup India. There's this mindset that everyone wants to invest in India. Most managers will, it's not necessarily top of mind.
What you need to do is get in touch with Madhumita. No, she's here. She's part of Invest India. They are responsible for Startup India.
I don't want to deal with Startup India. That's a waste of government.
No. I'm not talking about Startup India. I'm talking about Invest India.
No, even Invest India, it's a waste of taxpayer money. Do not spend Indian taxpayer money on Invest India. Please don't do that.
Okay. All right. Maybe we take the next question. And please ask a question. I mean, you can obviously make a statement, but it'd be good to ask a question since the other panelists
My name is Padam Lal Mahajan. I'm from Nepal. We are pleased to attend here, my wife and myself. And regarding the aviation, I just want to touch a question for Jayantji. Having no aircraft is a problem. Having too much aircraft is a problem. As you said, that it grew from 300 to 400. Now, basically, I can give you one example of Nepal and Thailand. Started same time, and Thailand, where it went, Nepal still down to zero. It is especially because of the corruption in Nepal. But my question to Jayantji is that if a private company could take Air India, take over and plan to make money, government surely would be able to do better. What's your plan to make changes in administratively and management in aviation so that Air India can be in profit? Thank you.
That's a question we'll have to take offline because I've worked in the aviation industry for 3 years. We've done a whole host of changes. But very quickly, if you want to transform Air India, the bidding is on right now, sir. Please bid for it.
No, I worked with aviation, but I'm not able to bid. I'm from IIT Madras, and congratulations, you are from IIT Delhi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's take the next question.
Excuse me, sir. Just saying.
Hi.
Sorry, you have to the side. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, I have a question for Mr. Jayant Sinha. My name is Bina Agarwal. And the question is, like we often see when a new government comes in the state, they just roll back or sideline the projects that were approved and being implemented by the past government. So how can we come up with an institution that can safeguard the investments that have been done by the private investors, and this kind of political revenge or vengeance don't occur with, they don't become a part of that political vengeance?
No, that's a very good question, and of course, the sanctity of contracts is very important. So, independent of which political dispensation signed a contract, once the contract is signed by the government of a state, then you have to honor those contracts. And that case law is currently, in process of being settled through a variety of High Court and Supreme Court rulings, and I'm very hopeful that that will in fact be settled, and we will make our contracts pretty watertight as a result of that.
So I can say that
we've got to go
Thank you,
through.
sir.
I mean, I think you're referring something to the Andhra Pradesh issue right now, which has come on the energy
even
side.
Maharashtra, we see it very often.
Yeah. All right, got it.
Hello, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to get the thoughts of the panel on bank loans, NPA, bad bank loans, etc. And separately, outside of that, there's been an approach where CBI is, I guess, being quota-driven or target-driven, and they are, I guess, bringing in bank managers or bank associates from bank who've just signed on bad loans and are not intentionally involved in fraud, and putting the onus on them to prove their innocence.
Okay, so maybe I'll get Mihir to address this topic about the credit, because you talked about that. Plus, you also talked about overreaching tax officers. He's not talking about overreaching CBI officers.
Well, it's part and parcel. And thank you. Very quickly, I think we have to recognize that the NPA problem, there was a serious overhang from the boom years, which Jayant referred to, and that has been addressed in several ways. Not sufficiently yet to maybe see a recovery in bank lending, but I think we may have to wait a bit for that. But you're absolutely correct that there's this holy trinity of, vigilance guys, the CBI guys, and the tax people, and everyone is terrified at this point of making a decision that at some point, even 20 years later after you've retired, and you don't no longer have access to resources or even the files that you had, will come back and hit you in the face. And particularly at a time when you're saying that you need a kind of relationship between government, I mean, as Jayant just pointed out, if somebody has problems, we should send them to Invest India. But if you need a kind of relationship between government or quasi-government agencies and investors that allows people to have a certain confidence in each other, and that confidence has broken down just now, and I think that's something that we need to address. It's a political push that hasn't happened, and maybe it'll happen in the future, but currently I think that's a crisis that we also have to deal with.
Okay, maybe take the next question.
Hello, sir. Hello, everyone. My name is Sumit Olivier. I quit my software job 3 months ago and started a filmmaking company here in Arlington. And my question is about difference in work culture of America and India, and what, according to you, everybody here can do and must do to make the Indian side of it better. And I grew up in India for 28 years of my life, and I've been here for 6 years now. And I think the number one reason America is the leading economy of the world is a janitor at MIT and a medical professional at Harvard can share romance, and a professor helps them. And I'm talking about a movie, Good Will Hunting, but that has been my real life experience here as well. When I was new here, I lived in a sublet owned by a Russian nuclear scientist who quit his Texas nuclear plant job to start a moving company here. And on the weekends, I would work with him, we would move boxes, And of all of our clients from all across the world, he had a problem with Indian clients because we weren't given the respect for our work. They treated us differently from other people.
All right. So can we get the specific question that you want?
The question is how, like, I talked about a movie, janitor, medical professional and all that, but it is my real life experience. I moved boxes with a nuclear scientist.
Okay. So the question really is that how do you change the mindset of the Indian professional?
We have professors here, we have parliamentarians here. How can I see similar respect for all work, all workplaces and all workers in India the way I see it in America?
All right. Who would like to take that?
I think you got to stop watching Hollywood movies and start watching Bollywood movies.
All right, let's.
Just as a half a sentence, that I think the issue of inequality that you raise is actually very fundamental, and we've been talking a lot about wealth and economic inequality, but perhaps we haven't talked enough about social inequality. We touched on it yesterday, but surely those are factors which prevent people with the best skills and the best minds to be inducted into the best jobs. There are all kinds of discriminatory practices which we need to do much about. And it's a long-term structural issue, if I may say.
All right. We probably have time for one more question.
On that side, on this side here.
Okay, on this side.
I just want to make.
Sorry, that's the line of sight there. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
I just want to make a reservation against what Mr. Sinha has stated a couple of times in his speech here.
Okay, do you have a question?
Few seconds, and just.
No, I think we really want to use this.
Couple of times in his talk, he's tried to downplay what has happened on the other side of the river. Very purposefully and smartly, he tried to downplay what happened there. What happened there yesterday had to do with the real issues that are going on in India. Mostly was about.
Absolutely. I think we need to focus questions here. Excuse me, sir. Please.
Do not have economy.
With due respect. Yeah, go ahead. Question.
I do have a question to Mr. Jayant Sinha. Well, building on that, it's a question. You've talked about sustainability, but I find that in government policy, those sustainability issues are not built into the framework. And when Ms. Bina Agarwal raised an issue, you just said, why not set up an NGO? Why should that not be integrated into government policy? Why should sustainability, can you give us an example of what the government is doing?
So sustainability. So I'll answer that question. Yeah. So as far as sustainability is concerned, India is widely seen around the world as a global leader. We signed the Paris Agreement. In fact, we were one of the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Modi ji was a prime mover behind the Paris Agreement. We have already overachieved our targets relative to the Paris Agreement. There are many other countries that have in fact pulled out of the Paris Agreement. We are in fact very much on track and are overachieving our Paris Agreement NDCs as they're called, and the Indian economy relative to its carbon emission targets, etc., is actually doing a super job. And I can tell you that every aspect of whether it's the Jal Jeevan Mission, whether it is what we're doing with single-use plastic, whether it's what we're doing with solid waste management, sustainability issues are uppermost in everyone's mind. And I'll close by saying that in this budget, the Honorable Finance Minister has put 4,000 crores into a national clean air mission targeted at cities over 1 million. So that's all, just a quick snapshot of some of the steps we've taken. Sustainability is built into all of our policies, and I think we are really doing a terrific job in that regard.
In all fairness, Jayant did talk about competitiveness and sustainability right in his opening remarks. Bina, did you want to add to that? Because we need to take one more question and we close.
Just very quickly that yes, certainly India has been doing very well in terms of agreements, but I think when many of us think of sustainability, we also think of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is about poverty, hunger, issues of health, issues of climate change, issues of gender equality. Yeah. And so those are also when we look at those targets, then I think there are huge challenges, and we have to admit it.
And there are, of course, Binaji, there are challenges in India. We are a very poor country of 1.37 billion people. But as far as the Sustainable Development Goals are concerned, let me assure you that within the Niti Aayog, there's a department that is there simply from monitoring the implementation of sustainable development goals across all the government ministries. And in fact, to your point earlier about independent verification, that is happening. And in fact, we've had a whole series of meetings in Parliament about how well we're doing on our SDGs. And we are actually doing quite a good job. I mean, I can go on and on with the facts and figures, but we made tremendous progress, in fact, in moving people out of extreme poverty in India.
Okay, we kind of at the close of the session, but let me take one question there and then we will
Thank
close.
you. Indrani Medhi, I'm a technology researcher. I do field-based work. So you talked about solutions, toilets, behavior change. I spent a lot of time doing fieldwork in rural Madhya Pradesh, and I saw that women don't use these toilets because there's no running water, and it takes a lot of time to procure running water. So do you think we need solutions that are more user-centered, where users are stakeholders in the design process? Involve them, ask them what they want, and do you think we need solutions which are more
You're absolutely right. And, Mr. Parmeshwaran Iyer, who is the Secretary in Drinking Water and Sanitation, is one of the most progressive and most proactive civil servants you'll find anywhere. If you have any good solutions, I personally commit to you. Any good solutions you might have, I will set up a meeting for you with Mr. Iyer, and you can take to him whatever solution you had about behavior change and improving things in India. But I can assure you that the designs that have been implemented by Mr. Iyer and his department are ones that have been based on massive amounts of global research in close collaboration with the best independent research institutions on this. And of course, as I said, behavior change is something that will take a long time to happen, but we are moving forward, and we are moving forward very successfully.
Sorry, Mihir, you want to say one last comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We have to, you can take it after. Yeah.
I just want to sort of finish off by this sort of discussion by saying, look, for example, Parmeshwar is excellent, very impressive public servant. This is a great goal, but this is classic. This is a classic example of how maybe we need to expand how we're thinking about India's development. The fact is that since we're talking about this side of the river and that side of the river, all our solutions that we're looking at are actually coming from that side of the river. Jayant, you're sounding like you're in the Kennedy School, all right, saying, come, tell the government how to fix it. We're talking to research institutes. The only way to solve these problems is by trusting the individuals themselves, by ensuring that they have access to the money that they need, the credit they need, so that they can themselves buy the toilets that they want, all right?
So Mihir, I started off by saying, of course, that it is what is going to drive India forward is competitiveness. And when I said competitiveness, I meant competitiveness of Indian companies, which are precisely driven by entrepreneurs, by individuals, and all of our civil society actors and so on and so forth. So obviously, government is only a facilitator. At the end of the day, you have to get the job done. And with respect to even toilets for that matter, toilets have been implemented in a variety of different ways. In some places, 12,000 rupees has been given per household, and people have used that, and I've seen it myself, to expand the toilets that they have or improve upon the toilets that they want to build. So they can either choose to take the money themselves and do it themselves, Mihir, or alternatively, they can have a government contractor build it for them, which has also happened. So there is a lot of experimentation going on. Of course, there are things that only the government can do, and that's that side of the river. But remember, and of course we know it, that more than 75% of the economy, even in India, is entirely in the private sector, which is this side of the river. And so obviously we have to, both of us, work together to make it happen. There is a bridge, in fact. So
lots of them. There are four or five bridges.
There's a way to make it happen.
Well, okay, I'll give Bina the last word and then I'm going to wrap up.
So I think a key word would be really cooperation. And not just competition.
Yes, no, there is, by the way, that's, I think we're just exaggerating this, and the gentleman over there at the back made a vociferous comment. I'm sorry, sir, we've run out of time. We don't have time. But look, I think just to wrap this up, while we've obviously poked holes, we've kind of evaluated where we are, the fact of the matter is that, while we are going through a slowdown, there's a diagnosis of the patient. There are lots of things which should be done, which are not being done. There, I would argue, a lot of things which are, we're talking about toilets. I suppose the government hadn't come up with this thing of every person has to have a toilet. We won't be complaining about it because it won't even be there. So there are a lot of things which have been done. I am personally, bullish in the medium to long term. I think the cooperation issue, which Bina talked about, is a fantastically important one. The overreaching issue and concerns that Mihir talked about is a really, really important one because it does impede the competitive dynamic and the psyche of the citizen. But all in all, I think what we're hearing from the panel is that growth is here, The government is focused on it. There are lots of issues that need to be addressed, which have come up through the panel as well as through questions. And I would say that even at the Harvard School here, when we talk about India, there's actually a lot of joint projects. You should just know this. Between the business school, the Kennedy School, the School of Public Health, the School of Education, the Divinity School. In fact, the Harvard South Asia Initiative, or now it's an institute, really brings all of these elements across Harvard University together. So while we joke about this river and that river, which is probably I shouldn't have started off with that, it was my fault. There actually is a big focus on collaborating and bringing all the intellectual capital that this university has to offer to solve important problems in India. So with that, let me please join me in thanking the panel.
And just one quick thing.
Oh, the politician has to have the last word.
Democracy is debate, dissent, and dialogue. And I'm very glad to see that we have a very vibrant democratic discussion and debate going on. That's what will make our country strong and better. Thank you very much.